Let's shift our focus to France now. An independent inquiry has found that 216,000 minors were abused by the French Catholic clergy in the last 70 years. The church failed to prevent these cases, failed to report them, failed to bring its clergy to justice. What's more, the report says that the church's teachings on sanctity of the priest only created the blind spots needed to allow such sexual abuse. Here's the report.
It happened in his room, which he locked. But the touching took place in the kitchen, in the presbytery.
You no longer know where you live.
These are victims of the French Catholic Church. Marie-Claire Sylvester was abused by a paedophile priest who was also her uncle. Marie-Claire kept the abuse a secret, buried it until 2008.
I don't really remember when it started. I was looking at photos because my dad took a lot of holiday photos. He was a teacher in the Catholic school. He was very religious. That's how it happened. I was turning 6.
There are at least 216,000 others like Marie-Claire, all victims of the French clergy. If you account for those abused by church associates like teachers of Catholic schools, then the total number of victims becomes 330,000. That's how many lives the French Catholic Church has scarred in the last 7 decades. Most of them were boys aged 10 to 13. Jean-Marie was one of them. He is 82 years old now.
I quote from one of the predators, "You should have stopped me. It's not right. It's a sin."
Sin is what the French clergy has committed. The 6th commandment says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." An independent inquiry commission has found that there were at least 3,200 pedophiles in the French Catholic Church. What does the 5th commandment say? "Thou shalt not kill." Many of the church's victims died. 20% of the victims were girls. In fact, those abused by French priests, nuns, and church associates account for 6% of all victims of sexual abuse in France. What happened to the culprits? Just a handful of them received disciplinary action under canonical law. In May 2019, Pope Francis vowed to address abuse by priests. The French Catholic Church commissioned an inquiry. Heading it was Jean-Marc Sauve, a retired French civil servant. His team spent 2.5 years going through records at courts, police stations, and the church.
The abuse committed by clerics primarily concerns male children, young boys who represent nearly 80% of the victims.
Shortly after taking up the job, Sauve received a letter. It was from a former boarding school classmate. The classmate recounted abuse by a priest who gave music lessons to both him and Sauve. The priest had also gone on to abuse dozens of other boys. Sauve's commission discovered that the abuser had suddenly left the boarding school. It also found that 2.5% of French clergy had sexually abused minors since 1950. This was a systemic abuse, one that the Roman Catholic Church was burying under a veil of silence. Eric Boone was the first victim the commission heard. Boone is 49 years old. He was sexually abused by a Dominican friar. Boone was a young teenager then. Today, he is demanding a reform of the clergy.
There were monastic reforms in the 11th century, and as there was the Protestant reform in the 16th century. Today there is a reform of the church to be lived, that is to say, a return to the sources.
The inquiry report says the church's teaching on sexuality, the sanctity of the priesthood, created the blind spots, ones that allowed for sexual abuse. What's more, the church was indifferent to these abuses until the 2000s. Does the church have anything to say in its defense?
My desire on this day is to ask you for forgiveness to each and every one.
Reform helps. Regret? Not so much. That's our advice, just in case the Vatican happens to be making notes. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.